New Zealand sells you a very particular picture. Green hills stitched with sheep. Fjords cut so deep the light barely reaches the water by mid-afternoon. A haka performed for cruise ship passengers who clap on the wrong beat. A hangi dinner, a photograph beside a carved pouerua at the airport before the flight home. That is the postcard version. That is the country built for the 11 o'clock departure and the souvenir shop. But underneath that image is a landscape that Maori communities shaped, engineered, defended, and sometimes walked away from, long before any European ship reached these coasts. Massive earthworks cut into volcanic cones. Kilometres of terracing carved by hand. Storage complexes built with more precision than most visitors ever pause to consider. Some of it we understand reasonably well. Some of it, honestly, we do not. Not the scale of the labour, not the exact timing, not always even the full purpose. Tonight, I want to take you through 13 of these places. Structures built by hapu and iwi across both islands. Places the archaeologists have measured, mapped, and argued over for decades. Places where the official explanation and the physical evidence in the ground do not always sit comfortably together. Go on, subscribe, and I'll tell you the whole story. Number 13. Ōtātara and Hikurangi Pā, above Taradale, just outside Napier. You wouldn't necessarily know it from the road. Two grassy hills, a scenic reserve car park, a walking track that most people treat as a decent view over the Tutaekura and Ngāruroro River plains, and nothing more. But climb those hills properly, and the ground itself starts telling a different story. Terracing runs continuously across both slopes, hundreds of individual house platforms cut into the hillside. Kūmara storage pits by the dozen, defensive ditches still visible after centuries of weather. Ōtātara and Hikurangi were occupied from roughly the 16th century through into the 18th, associated with Ngāti Kahungunu and related hapu of the region, and named in part for the rangatira Hikurangi. At its peak, estimates put the resident population somewhere in the low thousands during periods of heightened conflict between coastal and inland groups. It is, by physical footprint, one of the largest fortified PA complexes ever recorded in this country. The official account, the one you'll find on the interpretation panels, describes it plainly. A defensive settlement, expanded over generations, abandoned as the pattern of settlement shifted after European contact. What the panels don't quite capture is the labour question. Terracing at this density across two full hillsides using stone tools and no draft animals, sustained across multiple generations without anything resembling a centralised state apparatus. The organisational effort behind that is not fully explained by "they built it over time." Archaeologists still debate the exact sequence in which the two hills were developed, and whether occupation was continuous or moved back and forth as conditions changed. Stand at the top on a clear day and you can see exactly why the spot was chosen. Command of two river valleys, sight lines for kilometres. What you can't see, standing there, is the answer to how a community without engineers in the modern sense managed to hold and maintain a fortification of this scale for 200 years. The hill remembers the labour. It just isn't telling us how it was organised. There's a further detail that rarely makes it into the visitor pamphlets. Excavations here have turned up evidence of repeated remodelling. Terraces widened, ditches redug, palisade lines shifted a few metres one way or another across different occupation phases. That's not the record of a single grand construction project. It's the record of a living settlement, adjusting itself generation after generation to new threats, new alliances, and new needs, in ways that a single built-once narrative simply can't account for. Number 12. Maungakiekie, known to most visitors simply as One Tree Hill, in the heart of Auckland. Most people who climb Maungakiekie today are chasing a view or a photo beside the obelisk at the summit. Few of them realise they are walking across what was, in its time, one of the largest and most heavily fortified PA in the entire country. A volcanic cone, reshaped almost entirely by human hands. The terracing at Maungakiekie is extraordinary in density. Ring after ring of flattened platforms circle the cone. Hundreds of Kūmara storage pits pock the slopes, and the summit itself was reworked into a fortified citadel, commanding views across the isthmus in every direction. Occupation dates back centuries before European contact, tied closely to Waipoua and later Ngati Wātua history in Tamaki Makaurau, a region so contested precisely because it sat on the narrow neck of land between two harbours. Control it, and you controlled trade and movement across the whole isthmus. The official record treats Maungakiekie as a straightforward defensive maximisation of a naturally strong position. True enough, as far as it goes. What it undersells is the sheer volume of earth moved and reshaped without metal tools, on a slope that is, in places, brutally steep. Some sections of terracing required cutting directly into volcanic scoria, a material that does not yield easily to stone adzes. Estimates of the labour hours involved run into the hundreds of thousands, spread across generations of continuous habitation and rebuilding. There is also the matter of the Ōtātara tree that gave the hill its English name. Cut down by settlers in the 19th century, a loss that still carries weight for local iwi today. A reminder that the erasure of this landscape's Māori history didn't stop with fortification, but continued well into living memory. Stand at the summit now, beside a monument to a very different story than the one the hill actually holds. And it's worth asking what exactly we are looking at when we look at Auckland's skyline. A modern city built directly on top of an engineering achievement most of its residents have never been told about. Number 11. Pouerua, a volcanic cone in the Bay of Islands hinterland, inland from Kerikeri. Pouerua doesn't get anywhere near the visitor numbers of Maungakiekie, largely because it sits on private and iwi-managed land away from the main tourist routes. That relative obscurity is part of why it matters so much to archaeologists. It has survived with less disturbance than almost any comparable site in the north. What makes Pouerua genuinely unusual is not just its scale, though the terracing is extensive, but its occupation record. Excavations here have revealed multiple distinct phases of PA construction and abandonment on the same cone, going back centuries, each phase built directly over the last, like architectural layers in a cake. Researchers have used this stratification to build one of the more detailed timelines of Northland Maori settlement anywhere in the country. Successive waves of construction, expansion, retreat and rebuilding, tracked almost like tree rings. The official narrative frames Pouerua as a case study, a site valuable precisely because its layered history is so legible. That's accurate. What it glosses over is the harder question underneath. Why did communities repeatedly return to rebuild on exactly the same cone, generation after generation, rather than establishing themselves permanently at ground level nearby, where building would have been considerably easier? Was it purely strategic, the volcanic height offering security each time conflict flared? Or did the place itself carry a significance, a mana, that made it worth the repeated effort, regardless of the labour cost? Local tradition leans toward the latter. The archaeological record can measure the layers. It cannot fully explain the pull. Pouerua sits quietly now, mostly ignored by the road that passes near it, holding centuries of decisions inside its slopes that nobody alive can fully reconstruct. Archaeologists have spent entire careers on this one cone, and still can't tell you, with full confidence, why the same hill kept pulling people back. Number 10. Ōtākanini Pā, on the South Kaipara Head, west of Auckland. Ōtākanini sits in a landscape most people drive straight past on the way to the west coast beaches. Dune country, wind-battered, unglamorous at first glance. But beneath the surface here, waterlogged conditions have preserved something rare. Wooden artifacts, structural timbers, and organic material that almost never survives this long anywhere else in the country. Excavated across several seasons from the 1960s onward, Ōtākanini has produced carved wooden objects, remains of storage structures, and evidence of occupation stretching back many centuries, associated with early Ngati Wātua and related groups in the Kaipara region. The waterlogged, low-oxygen soil conditions acted almost like a time capsule, preserving wood that would have rotted away completely at a drier site. The official account treats Ōtākanini primarily as a preservation success story, a rare window into material culture that is usually lost to time. Fair enough. But the site has also produced dating anomalies that researchers have never fully resolved. Material from different layers that doesn't always line up cleanly with the expected sequence of occupation. Artifact styles that seem to appear earlier or persist later than comparable sites elsewhere in the region. None of this is dramatic enough to overturn the broader timeline of Maori settlement in Northland. It is, however, enough to keep specialists cautious about treating any single site's dating as the final word. What Ōtākanini really offers is a rare, direct look at objects that people actually held, carved and used, not just the shape of the ground they walked on, but fragments of the things they made with their hands. Fishhooks, adze handles, fragments of woven material that would have disintegrated within a decade almost anywhere else in the country. And still, after decades of study, nobody has fully explained why the sequence of material found here doesn't always match expectations. Number 9. The garden terraces of Anaura Bay on the east coast, north of Gisborne. Anaura Bay carries a specific kind of historical weight. It was one of the very first places in New Zealand where Captain Cook's crew made contact with Maori in October 1769, and Cook's own journal describes extensive, well-tended cultivation on the surrounding hillsides. What's remarkable is that you can still see the physical evidence of exactly what he described. The terraces at Anaura are agricultural rather than defensive. Broad, carefully graded platforms built for growing Kūmara, cut into hillsides with a precision that impressed European observers from the very first encounter. This was not subsistence farming scratched into whatever ground was available. It was organized, large-scale horticultural engineering, adapted specifically to a subtropical crop being grown at the southern edge of where it could survive. The official record treats Anaura primarily through the lens of first contact. The site matters because Cook wrote about it, because it appears in the earliest European written descriptions of Maori life. What that framing sometimes underplays is what the terracing itself represents on its own terms. Centuries of accumulated agricultural knowledge, careful management of soil, sun exposure and drainage, refined long before any outsider arrived to take notes on it. There is a quieter irony sitting underneath all of this, the very thing that made Anaura Bay worth writing home about. Its obvious cultivation and abundance became, within a few generations, the same kind of land Europeans wanted for themselves. The terraces that impressed Cook's crew were evidence of exactly the kind of sophisticated land use that colonization would later disregard, disrupt, and in many cases simply take. The hillsides at Anaura still hold their shape today, grass covered now instead of planted, a diagram of expertise nobody bothered to properly credit at the time. Number 8. The limestone rock art shelters of North Otago and the Waitaki Valley, South Island. Scattered across a stretch of limestone country in North Otago and reaching into South Canterbury are dozens of rock shelters bearing painted and drawn figures, birds, taniwa-like creatures, human forms, geometric patterns, created using red ochre and charcoal pigments on overhanging limestone faces. Some of this artwork is believed to date back many centuries, among the oldest surviving Maori artistic expression anywhere in the country. These are not large monumental structures like a PI. They are intimate, often small panels, tucked into rock overhangs that would have offered brief shelter to hunting or travelling parties moving through the interior. Associated with early Ngai Tahu and, in some interpretations, potentially earlier Moa hunter-era occupation of the South Island, the imagery includes figures that don't correspond cleanly to any bird or animal known to have existed in the region, long-necked, long-beaked creatures that some researchers connect to Moa since extinct, and others read as more symbolic or spiritual representations entirely. The official archaeological position treats the art as a valuable but incomplete record, degraded by weather, vandalism and time, difficult to date precisely, open to genuine interpretive disagreement about what many of the figures actually depict. That caution is appropriate. Pigment doesn't come with a signature or a date stamp, and a great deal of this art has faded past the point where any confident reading is possible. What lingers is the sheer number of sites, panel after panel, shelter after shelter, spread across a landscape that early Maori clearly moved through regularly and marked, deliberately, again and again. Some panels sit in genuinely difficult-to-reach overhangs, chosen it seems as much for shelter and privacy as for visibility. Whether those markings recorded journeys, told stories, marked territory, or served some purpose we no longer have any framework to guess at, is a question the rock itself has stopped answering, if it ever did. Number 7. The Kūmara storage pit complexes of the Maketū and Te Puke area, Bay of Plenty. Along the fertile river flats and low hills around Maketū, dozens of large Rua Kūmara underground storage pits survive as shallow depressions and paddocks and reserves, remnants of what was once one of the most productive Kūmara growing regions in the country. Maketū itself holds particular significance as one of the earliest and most enduring points of Māori settlement in the Bay of Plenty, associated with the Te Arawa migration tradition. The storage pits themselves are engineering in miniature, carefully sized and shaped chambers often lined and roofed, designed to keep Kūmara viable through winter storage in conditions that would otherwise cause the crop to rot. The density of pits found across the wider Maketū landscape suggests not casual, household-scale storage, but organised, large-volume management of a staple food crop across an entire community, season after season. The official framing treats these pit complexes as straightforward evidence of agricultural surplus, proof that this particular stretch of coastline supported large food-secure populations. That much is well established. Less settled is the question of exactly how storage practices here compare with, and possibly influenced, similar systems recorded elsewhere in the North Island. Some researchers argue Maketū represents an early centre of storage innovation that techniques elsewhere may have drawn from. Others caution that similar solutions likely developed independently in multiple regions facing the same basic problem of keeping a subtropical crop alive through a temperate winter. What's certain is the discipline behind it. Somebody, generations ago, worked out exactly how deep to dig, how to manage moisture and airflow, and how many pits a community of a given size actually needed to survive until the next harvest. Knowledge refined through trial, failure, and correction long before anyone wrote any of it down. There is no surviving manual for any of it. Just the pits themselves, still holding their shape in the paddocks, still roughly the size they need to be. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help, and that they make sense. It genuinely does make a difference to a channel this size, and honestly, it's the reason the research for these keeps happening at all. Number 6. The maramataka alignment stones associated with several East Coast and far north sites, most notably near Te Araroa and around the Hokianga. Among the more debated categories of Māori structure are arrangements of stones, some upright, some laid in deliberate lines or clusters, found at a number of sites across the North Island, which some researchers and local tradition bearers associate with maramataka, the Maori lunar calendar system used to track seasons, planting times, and significant celestial events. Unlike a PA or a terrace, these stone arrangements don't announce their purpose through obvious defensive or agricultural function. Some sites feature stones oriented toward points on the horizon that correspond to solstice or particular star risings, most notably the rising of Matariki, the star cluster whose reappearance in the dawn sky traditionally marked the Maori New Year. Local knowledge holders in several regions maintain that specific stones or stone groupings were used, within living memory in some cases, to track exactly these kinds of celestial markers. The official archaeological position here is notably cautious and worth stating plainly, distinguishing a deliberately placed astronomical marker from a naturally occurring rock formation, without written records or continuous unbroken oral documentation tying a specific stone to a specific practice, is genuinely difficult. Some claimed alignment sites have held up well under scrutiny. Others, examined more closely, turn out to align with the horizon roughly as often as chance would predict. This is a field where enthusiasm has sometimes outrun evidence, and responsible telling has to say so. What isn't in dispute is that maramataka itself was a sophisticated, detailed system of celestial and environmental observation, maintained orally and practically across generations, guiding fishing, planting, and travel with real precision. Whether any particular arrangement of stones still standing today was built to track it, or simply happens to sit where the sky puts on a good show twice a year, is a question that depends on evidence some of these sites may never fully yield. If you've been to any of these sites and picked up on something a guide or a local mentioned that I haven't covered here, I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments. This is exactly the kind of detail that doesn't always make it into the official write-ups. Number 5. The PAA and lookout structures of Kāpiti Island, off the Kāpiti coast, lower North Island. Kāpiti Island today is best known as a predator-free wildlife sanctuary, a place people visit to see kiwi and takahe rather than archaeology. But the island carries a dense human history, most famously as the stronghold of Te Rauparaha in the early 19th century, whose control of Kāpiti gave him command of the Cook Strait region during a turbulent period of inter-Iwi conflict and rapid change driven by the arrival of European muskets and trade. The island's steep terrain hosts multiple PA sites and lookout points, positioned to give commanding views up and down the strait. Critical for a leader whose power rested heavily on controlling maritime trade routes and monitoring the movement of both allies and rivals. Some of the fortification work here postdates first European contact, making Kāpiti a useful and unusually well-documented case of how quickly Māori military architecture adapted once muskets changed the calculus of defence. The official narrative around Kāpiti tends to centre on Te Rauparaha as an individual figure, a well-known name in New Zealand history, sometimes reduced in popular telling to a single simplified story of conquest. What that framing underplays is the structural sophistication behind his position, a network of fortified lookout points and PA that had to be actively maintained, staffed, and defended across a substantial and challenging island landscape, sustaining control for years against real and persistent opposition. There's also a harder layer beneath the strategic history. Kāpiti's rise to prominence involved displacement and conflict affecting the EWE who held the island and surrounding coast before Te Rauparaha's forces arrived, a history that isn't always given equal weight alongside the more famous chapters. That period, sometimes referred to as the Musket Wars era more broadly, reshaped iwi boundaries across much of the lower North Island within the span of a single generation, and Kāpiti sits right at the centre of that upheaval. The island remembers all of it, even the parts the popular version tends to skip past. Number 4. The Waipoua Stone Terraces, Northland within and around the boundaries of the Waipoua Kauri Forest. Waipoua is known internationally for one thing, Tainei Mahuta, the largest living kauri tree in the country, a genuine giant that draws visitors from across the world. Far fewer of those visitors realise that the forest and its margins also contain stone-faced terracing, and Pai remains connected to Te Roroa and related hapu, evidence of long-term Māori presence in and around a forest most tourists treat as untouched wilderness. The terracing here is smaller in scale than the great PI complexes further south, but notable for its integration with the forest itself. Structures built at the edges of kauri stands, using the forest's resources for construction while apparently respecting, in ways archaeologists are still working to fully map, particular trees and groves that oral tradition marks as significant or restricted. The official conservation narrative around Waipoua, understandably, foregrounds the forest, the kauri, the ecology, the fight to protect what remains of a tree species pushed to the brink by logging. Less prominent in that story is the fact that this landscape was never simply wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was managed, occupied, and shaped by Māori communities for centuries, with a relationship to specific trees and places that runs considerably deeper than the modern conservation framing sometimes acknowledges. Standing beneath Tainei Mahuta, most visitors are told a story about a tree's age and size. Fewer are told that the ground beneath their feet, for a considerable distance in every direction, carries its own separate and much older story, one where the forest and the people who lived in it were never really two different subjects. Number 3. The stone structures and Moa Hunter era sites of Rakiura, Stewart Island, at the southern edge of the country. Rakiura sits at the far southern reach of sustained early Maori settlement in New Zealand, and the archaeological sites scattered along its coastline. Stone-lined structures, shell middens, evidence of extensive moa processing, represent some of the southernmost evidence of the moa hunting period, when large flightless birds were a major food source before their extinction. The scale of some of these sites is striking, given how remote and, by comparison to the North Island, how resource-limited this environment can be. Substantial camps with stone hearth features and structural remains point to organised, seasonal use of the island by groups exploiting its rich coastal resources. Seals, seabirds, shellfish, and in the earlier centuries of occupation, moa themselves, hunted here as the birds retreated toward the last parts of the country, where they could still be found. The official record treats Rakiura's archaeology largely through the lens of the moa hunting period broadly, evidence supporting the wider understanding of how quickly moa populations collapsed following sustained human hunting pressure across the 13th to 15th centuries. What gets less attention is the specific question of just how far south organised settlement extended, and how communities sustained themselves in an environment this exposed, this cold, and this far from the agricultural crops like Kūmara that fed most of the rest of the country. Down here, subtropical horticulture simply doesn't work. Survival depended entirely on a different, harder-won kind of expertise. Rakiura's wind carries a different weight than the north. The structures that remain are smaller, sparser, harder won. Evidence of a community pushed to the very edge of what this landscape could support, and finding a way to make it work regardless. Number 2. Ruapekapeka Pā, in Northland, the site of one of the final and most significant battles of the Northern War in 1846. Ruapekapeka, the name translates roughly to the bat's nest, is unlike almost every other structure on this list, because it wasn't built to hold off stone or wooden weapons. It was built specifically to withstand British artillery, and it succeeded in ways that genuinely unsettled the colonial forces who eventually took it. Constructed under the direction of the rangatira Kāpiti, Ruapekapeka featured deep underground bunkers and tunnel systems connecting fighting positions designed to let defenders shelter from cannon fire and then re-emerge to fight. Essentially trench warfare, developed independently by Māori engineers, years before it became standard practice in European conflicts. British and colonial forces bombarded the PIA for roughly 10 days in December 1845 and January 1846, and the defenders simply weathered it, sheltering underground and inflicting real casualties whenever the attackers pressed forward. The official military history of Ruapekapeka tends to focus on the eventual British occupation of the PA, technically recorded as a colonial victory, because the defenders withdrew rather than surrender outright, timing their departure in ways still debated by historians. What that framing consistently underplays is the scale of the achievement the PA itself represents. A fortification system that anticipated tactics European armies wouldn't formalize for generations, built by a defending force facing an enemy with vastly superior firepower, and holding for far longer than the attackers expected or wanted. There's a particular irony that sits at the centre of Ruapekapeka's story. A PR whose defenders arguably won the tactical engagement decisively, in a war whose outcome was still recorded, in the official ledgers, as a loss. The bunkers are still there, quiet grass-covered depressions in a Northland paddock holding the physical proof of an engineering achievement the history books have never quite known how to credit properly. Number 1. The Kaimanawa Wall, deep in forestry land near Kaingaroa, central North Island. Of everything on this list, nothing has generated more genuine, ongoing argument than the Kaimanawa Wall, a section of rock face, roughly 8 metres high, composed of what appear to be large, roughly rectangular blocks stacked in courses, discovered by a local resident in the early 1990s and almost immediately the subject of intense public fascination. When it was first publicised, some commentators suggested the wall was evidence of pre-Māori construction by an unknown earlier culture, a claim that spread quickly through alternative history circles internationally and, for a period, drew real crowds and real controversy to a fairly remote patch of forestry land. Government agencies eventually commissioned formal geological assessment. The official position based on that geological survey is unambiguous. The wall is a natural formation, ignimbrite rock, compressed volcanic ash from the massive Taupo eruptions that fractured along natural joint lines into blocky, roughly rectangular shapes as it cooled and weathered over thousands of years. This is a genuinely common process in ignimbrite geology, and similar blocky rock faces exist elsewhere in the central North Island's volcanic country. Geologists are, on the evidence, about as confident on this point as they get, and yet the wall has never fully shaken its reputation. Partly that's a straightforward function of how alternative theories spread and persist, regardless of formal findings. But there's a more uncomfortable layer underneath the public fascination worth naming directly. Much of the pre-Māori mystery structure narrative that attached itself to sites like this one over the years has, historically, been used to imply, without evidence, and against the archaeological record, that Maori could not have built sophisticated structures themselves, and that something or someone else must have come first. That framing isn't a neutral curiosity. It has a track record of being used to diminish Maori history rather than illuminate it, and it deserves to be named as exactly what it is. What actually sits at Kaimanawa is, by the best available science, a striking natural rock formation shaped by immense volcanic forces. Genuinely worth seeing, genuinely strange to look at, and not, on the current evidence, built by anyone at all. The real mystery isn't who built the wall. It's why so many people wanted so badly for it to have been built by someone other than the people who were actually here. 13 places, 2 islands, centuries of labour, memory and argument, most of it carried out by hands that never expected any of it to end up disputed on a screen like this one, generations later. What strikes me most, looking back across all 13, isn't the mystery in any individual site. Most of them aren't really mysteries at all, not in the sense of being unexplained. They're simply undertold, undercredited, left off the itinerary in favour of a simpler postcard. The wall at Kaimanawa turned out to be stone and time and volcanic ash. Nothing more, nothing built by anyone. But the pā at Maungakiekie, the bunkers at Ruapekapeka, the terraces at Anaura and Ōtātara, those were built by people with names some of us still know, using knowledge refined over centuries and passed down without a single written record to lean on. That to me is the actual story worth telling. Not an unexplained wall in a forest. A country whose real engineering history has been sitting in plain sight the whole time. On hillsides most of us drive straight past, waiting for someone to bother looking properly. If any of you have stood at one of these sites and come away with a different read on what you were looking at, I'd like to hear it. Tell me in the comments below. Genuinely, some of the best corrections I get on this channel come from people who know a specific patch of ground far better than any book on my shelf ever could. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.